All right, folks. Big Battlegrounds patch just got announced. These changes looks like they'll be hitting October 15th. Huge hero changes, minion changes, both neutral and for some certain minion types. A little bit of everything here, so let's just jump right into it. Up first, Bartendotron has been removed. Probably one of those that'll come back later, reworked, but for now, with things like Omu, even Chinvala, they kind of do what he does, but in more interesting and dynamic ways. More importantly, perhaps, Ragnaros has been nerfed, and not just nerfed in one direction, but actually in two. So his dual part hero power, up first, he had to kill 20 minions to get his actual useful hero power. That's now been moved to 25 minions, which is usually going to change the breakpoint maybe by one turn. I mean, there's certainly going to be instances where it would have happened the same time anyway, where he has like 2 to go and he kills 8 minions that round. But occasionally that's going to stall it out by at least a turn, which is really significant because that makes it harder for Ragnaros to stay alive in those mid-game scenarios. If he got off to a bad start, sometimes he's going to get knocked out of the fight super early. Then beyond that, the buff is actually getting smaller, now becoming 3-3 instead of 4-4. Now, this is a little sad because you do lose a little bit of flavor of like gaining 8-8 with Ragnaros, who's been all about 8s historically, but probably a good change because the buff was really big and the swing, once you got the hero power, was immediate. Like that was enough of a buff right away that you usually won that next round as long as you prepared your board at all with the right kind of stuff. So any kind of cleave, divine shield, high value minion, etc. And this lowers that long-term swing, and then of course also just adds up over time. Over the course of 5 turns, you've lost 5-5 in total buffs. So this is a big hit to Ragnaros. I think it'll still be a competitive hero. I don't think he gets terrible because of this, because it's still just a nice passive buff in the mid game that really stacks up and you can target it on stuff you care about. There's a lot of good targets for it. So I think Ragnaros remains a solid, playable hero at this rate. Just I do think indeed he will no longer be the best hero in the game, which is a good change because right now he felt pretty frustrating to play against. Another new change here, we've got Maiev getting nerfed in the past. Her hero power in prison would give a minion +1/+1. Now it will only give that minion +1 attack. So reducing the buff here. And I think this is really meaningful in those early to mid game turns where Maiev starts to turn the corner because she's using her hero power to fuel a pretty nasty board. It's still going to be able to fuel things like finding triples more consistently and helping her push towards those late game builds, but it's going to come at risk now because she's going to be less likely to win fights in the early game. She's going to take extra damage, and of course, just like Ragnaros, sometimes that's going to line up where it hurts her pretty significantly. I'm having a little bit harder time reading this one, whether it's going to make Maiev a bad hero or just merely playable. I think the value of being able to find things on board for triples is still there, so she remains interesting to play, but definitely takes a hit off this one because she's going to lose a lot of mid-game fights now without having that health to bolster minions. Suddenly value trades are harder and you just don't win as often. Moving on to Chinvala here. You're getting a buff to Chinvala because Chinvala's been a pretty weak hero ultimately, despite being more interesting than Bartendotron. Both were fairly weak heroes. And now after you play 3 elementals, you're going to reduce the cost of your tavern by 3 instead of by 2. And that's big, particularly right now, though, with Chinvala. Like, everybody has been playing elementals a ton, even though from a win rate standpoint, they probably don't deserve the focus they've gotten because they're new and interesting, they're big, they're super fun. So that's hurt Chinvala. I almost wonder if this is a little bit risky because, like, once we get, a month or 2 from now and nobody cares about elementals as much anymore, Chinvala might have gotten a natural upgrade just from being less competitive in the shop where people were buying all the elementals. And therefore, Chinvala might have gotten much, much stronger just from having more elementals to buy. So this is a little bit scary, perhaps, but, I trust Blizz, and I think it's fine for now. Certainly that upgrading this and cheapening her upgrade tiers even further could go a long way. I did feel like sometimes it's just like I was a little bit off on getting that next upgrade that I really wanted, and 1 gold can certainly add up a lot and change breakpoint significantly. So, I think this takes Chinvala from a really bad hero to a mediocre hero, perhaps, and she'll continue to improve over time. Patchwork here, going back to 55 health. He was at 60 at one point. They brought him down to 50. Now he's going back to 55, so nice subtle buff here. And hey, I mean, there's all kinds of fights where you go down to like -2 health and you were just almost there. You just needed like 3 or 4 extra to turn the quarter to complete your build, and this lets you do that sometimes. You'll get that one extra turn, which can make a really big difference towards finalizing a late game build. So a great change for Patchwork. We got Sindragosa here. Minions are now going to get a +2/+1 buff, which will do a cool thing, I think, where it helps the minions stay relevant into the mid game more. So Sindragosa can perhaps be a little bit more aggressive with her tiering, just because they're going to trade up better for longer, so you can create some really crazy like Righteous Protectors with high attack that might carry you quite a bit into the mid to late game, just because they are going to trade so well. And, you know, you're ever tripling that buff starts to stack even harder. So I think this is an interesting change for Sindragosa, a hero I've always thought was a little bit underrated. I liked her early game dominance quite a bit, and this feels like that just takes it to another level. So keep an eye on Sindragosa. I think she might be decent. King Mukla, Bananarama, now has a chance to give King Mukla a big banana that gives a minion +2/+2. So I guess everybody else would get a regular banana. He'd get a big banana. It's a banana. How much could it cost? $12? I don't know. But it's an interesting change that helps him gain more advantage from his hero power than other people. Theoretically, he already did that by having the right minions and playing it sooner. But right now, this gives you a really distinct advantage. Now, the thing is, we don't know how often this chance is, so really hard to say how much of an impact this will be. If it's like half the time, that's a big deal. If it's like 1 every 10 times, maybe not very significant. So we'll have to wait and see. So now moving over to minions, 2 really significant changes here, just text-based. Whirlwind Tempest removed from the Battlegrounds minion pool. I don't know exactly what that one was about. I thought he was fine in the elemental set. Maybe they didn't want Crackling Cyclone to have Mega Wind Fury as often, because that could counter some builds straight up, like Pirates and Beasts, where you just like snipe their key stuff and kill everything before they get any buffs off. So maybe that was one reason. Maybe they thought he just wasn't that interesting. I'm not really sure. Also, Pogo Hopper has been removed, so Pogo Dreams are dead. Jandice getting a big nerf there, so Jandice didn't get affected directly via any kind of hero power change, but this is a big hit to Jandice anytime mechs are in play. I think Jandice is still an interesting hero. Without Pogos, there's a lot of fun stuff she can do, but certainly still a hit to her win rate significantly. Selfless Hero going to tier 2 instead of tier 1. Gonna make Selfless Heroes a little bit harder to find when you're putting them into late game builds with things like Giant Pogos or Giant Elementals or whatever it is. He's trying to gain some stabilization via Divine Shields, and this is a great in a pinch tier 1 to buy in those scenarios. Putting it to tier 2 just makes it slightly harder to find, slightly harder to triple, all of which I think will have a good change on the game. It felt like Selfless Hero was way too good for a tier 1 unit, and you also kind of hated buying it on tier 1 too. So this is probably a feel-good change in multiple directions as far as I'm concerned. Deadly Spore, exact same story, going to tier 5 instead of tier 4. I felt the same way as I do about Deadly Spore as I did about Selfless Hero, where it was just dictating late game builds too much. Like, you'd get to the late game, you'd both been working on these amazing like giant elemental boards, and then suddenly you queue up and everybody has like 3 Deadly Spores, and it's just like the Deadly Spore battles, which isn't really all that interesting when you're talking about building giant minion type boards. So it felt like to me Deadly Spore was just a little bit too predominant. I think it's cool that it exists as a counter, and that's nice to have as a tech card, but again, just making it harder to find by putting it to tier 5, keeping less in the pool means it's going to be harder to use that strategy and harder to pivot that hard into it. All of those are great changes. Salty Looter going up to 4/4 at a base level. Already a pretty interesting minion for pirates. As you'll see, there are a handful of pirate buffs here, which the type certainly needed. And a 4/4 Salty Looter feels a lot better to buy on its own, I think. It's not that like tier 2 stat line of a 3/3. It's a tier 3 stat line of a 4/4. So even if you don't have the buff right away, this makes it feel a little bit sturdier on board. That's a big change. I think that'll help pirates with their main build around here in the early to mid game feel much, much better. We also got the Bloodsail Cannoneer going to a 4/3. Same thing here, just a little bit more stickiness where you're happy to leave this on board. Suddenly it doesn't die to a front half of a Murloc Tidehunter. It takes that trades again. All of those are great changes. We got Party Elemental here going to a 3/2 instead of a 2/2. Now this is intriguing, right? Because most people weren't expecting elementals to need a buff, which we're going to see another one here as well. I think maybe what Blizzard is planning is to make elementals more interesting in the early game as opposed to all about those late game builds. So, you know, a very slight change here, putting this at 3 attack. It trades up a little better than some of those 3/3s at tier 2. I'm totally fine with that because it does take a while for Party Elemental to snowball. And you feel really bad buying it on like your 6 gold turn or something because it's just a 2/2 and you didn't get to do anything with it. So this makes it a little bit more palatable to buy early. Arcane Assistant, same story here, is a buff card. Really surprised to see this one change. I mean, we have Felfin Navigator is a 4/4 with the same exact effect, but Elemental's just different playstyle. So I was totally fine with this being a 3/2. 3/3 also fine. Majordomo Executus here getting a pretty interesting change. Essentially, he just has a base buff. He's going to give +1/+1 even if you don't buy elementals, and then the same upside as normal currently, where each elemental you buy increases that by +1/+1. So he's kind of like a bad neutral Iron Sensei at a base level, but a 6/3 is really not too bad. And then a lot of upside in any kind of elemental thing. So, you know what? I think this becomes a pretty interesting in a pinch minion now, where you've got the Cave Hydra, you've got the Divine Shield, and you're just happy to buff that targeted thing very specifically. And you occasionally roll some upside. If you have like a little rag build, you can do a lot of work with this where you're cycling a bunch of elementals anyway to buff stuff, and Majordomo becomes a part of that. So maybe some kind of like menagerie little rag build. Keep an eye out on this. I think it makes Majordomo way more interesting, whereas right now, just not a very exciting card. Moving on, Little Rag actually going to tier 6 and becoming a 6/6 instead of being a tier 5 minion. So this gives one less like power spike kind of play on tier 5, of which there are currently a ton. You've got Little Nomi, assuming he's not changed here, to keep you strong on tier 5 for elementals, but you move this one to tier 6, so it becomes less of that super flexible buff card, kind of like Bran for any kind of build, which makes elementals a little bit less contested, which helps elemental builds stabilize. And then finally, Gentle Jenny here is going down to tier 5, also losing some stats along the way. So moving the kind of big scaling upside of Little Rag to tier 6, moving the sort of value resource of Gentle Jenny here to tier 5. And I like that change. I think that's a really good change. Those minions feel better at each of those respective tiers to me and make more sense, making tier 6 a little bit more desirable in many cases, changing the scaling impact a little bit, and putting resource generators like this one at tier 5. It feels good because it's easier to find this, put it in your build in the middle, easier to cycle into it with Nomi builds and stuff, and create some real shenanigans. So big buff to Jenny, a big nerf to Rag. Frankly, it's going to be a lot less likely to see Rags, but both probably still playable cards. Now, what does this mean for the meta? I don't know. There's a lot of changes here. Too many to really parse and figure out exactly where things are going to go. Elementals still look solid. Pirates look a little stronger, but probably not strong enough, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if 2 changes does it. So we'll have to see. But it's good to see this many changes coming to Battlegrounds. I wish we had the same for Standard, but I'll take what we can get. And curious to hear your thoughts on these changes for Battlegrounds. Share those in the comments down below. Thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.
Step aside.